Have you ever read a horror book or series and thought to yourself, man, there was so much more story here. I would have loved to read a little bit more and find out what happens to the characters who make it through, who survive to live another day. Here is a list of my top 5 horror or thriller novels or series that I feel like deserved a sequel. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm Nikhil with Shelf-Esteem. I'm a composer, now also a booktuber. You can find my music in The Wheel of Time Season 2, His Dark Material Season 3, and the newly released psychological horror film, Dead Whisper. So I wanted to kind of do something I haven't really seen. I'm always trying to find like video ideas I don't see as much on Booktube, just to try to, vary things up a little bit. And I've been on a horror kick lately, as I'm sure a lot of you have, that being spooky season and all. But I've been thinking a lot because I've been reading a lot of horror books this last, couple weeks. And I've been thinking about some of the horror catalog that I've had the good fortune to read over the years, Stephen King being no exception to that rule, as you can see from my shelf back here. And so, I thought about like a lot of horror doesn't have, long series like you would see in a fantasy series or something like that. Usually you'll see like a standalone, maybe a trilogy or something like that. And even for some of the trilogies, they'll end ambiguously where you feel like, there's a little bit more story to be explored here. So I figured I would kind of talk about my top 5, and I'm actually not ranking these, so these are in no particular order, but these are 5 that I wish there's more story here. I would have loved to hear what happened to these characters. So without further ado, let's jump on into the books. I'm going to leave this in the description as well. All the links to the books so you can check them out for yourself and you can purchase them. And of course, I'm an Amazon affiliate, so I make a small percentage of the sales. That's one way to support the channel. If you like this kind of video, please like and subscribe. That also helps out the channel. Feel free to join our new Discord channel, which is also linked below. Hope you enjoyed this list. And I would love to also hear after this video, if you're able to write in the comments and let me know. I always like to have a dialogue and, find out new books together and kind of experience new stories together. So let me know if you have some recommendations beyond this list as well. So let's jump into the book. So the first one, I read one of the first Stephen King books I read was Salem's Lot. It was his second published work. Salem's Lot has been getting a lot of eyes on it now with this new 2024 adaptation. Sometimes adaptations are great, sometimes they're not. But the good thing about them is at least, no matter, whether they're good or not, they seem to at least highlight the book, bring it back into public consciousness. They increase, the exposure of these books and to new audiences and things like that. So I'm always grateful whenever an adaptation comes out, regardless. But Salem's Lot is no exception. I felt like the story was phenomenal. It was one of King's scarier books, and I think it still holds up today. The idea of finding out some of the events that take place towards the end of the book at the very beginning, but not really having contextual reference. And as the story kind of unfolds into the madness of these vampires, which is not a spoiler because that's kind of the well-known trope that Stephen King explores and really makes vampires very scary. So that's a wonderful aspect of the story. I think there's a particular confrontation that happens towards the end of the book that is so momentous. And then the surviving characters, exit stage left, right? I'm just going to keep it as high level as possible so I don't spoil anything for you all, because I never want to do that with these stories. But, going back to the story, they exit stage left. And there was a sequel story, I believe, called One for the Road, which was released in Stephen King's Night Shift collection. Now, in this particular story, there is a return to Jerusalem's Lot, which is where the events of Salem's Lot take place, to kind of finish what they started. And I felt like that story is a really good sequel, but it kind of still leaves things ambiguous. It leaves it unresolved, and I would have loved a full novel exploration of a sequel, an actual definitive resolution to it. I know that also, for those of you who don't know, certain characters are explored in the Dark Tower series. So if you want to kind of get a little bit more of an addendum to where do these characters end up, one of those characters is richly explored in the 5th book, Wolves of the Kala, in the Dark Tower series. So if you haven't read the Dark Tower and you don't, read Salem's Lot before you read the Dark Tower, so you're not spoiled on anything. But that's another exploration of this. But I feel like a full dedicated novel would have been actually really awesome. And it's something like Stephen King has already done with The Shining and Dr. Sleep. So it shows that he still has it in him to do that. And, I keep holding out on the hope that we'll get a Salem's Lot sequel. But that's the first one on my list. Now, the second one I read a couple years ago, and it is the fastest 950-page book I have ever read. And that is by an author named Robert McCammon, who's fast become one of my favorite horror authors. And the book is Swan Song. So Swan Song is a sprawling epic. It's often compared to Stephen King's The Stand, in that it's very post-apocalyptic. But instead of like kind of a plague wiping out 99.2% of the population or what have you, it is a nuclear holocaust, which becomes a little bit prescient for today's times, right? With the threat of world wars and nuclear arms and everything like that being kind of the topic of today's conversation, political discourse and all that. So it's especially harrowing to read, but I think the thing about the majesty of this book is not about the actual nuclear holocaust, but everything that comes after, because first few pages are about the actual events, and the second is about the survivors. Like the rest of the book is about the survivors, and it's also about how society might devolve in such an instance, and also about the evils that people do to each other. Now, I will say it does have an ending, but I don't feel like it's the ending. I feel like Robert McCammon richly explores these characters so well that you get to know them, and the ones that survive, you want to see how they kind of rebuild after the events that take place in Swan Song. And I think that he could have actually done a really dedicated sequel to this book, and I don't think it would have taken away from the first book at all. It just left the ending open to interpretation. It left the ending open to more stories to be explored. So that's the second one. If you haven't checked that out, I gotta say, like, drop everything you're doing, just put all your other books aside. This is one to pick up and just say screw the TBR, because it's that good, honestly. And it's often it's often touted as one of his best works and a horror classic, but also very underrated, I think. So the third entry on this list, I guess, again in no particular order, speaking of post-apocalyptic, is of course The Stand by Stephen King. So as I mentioned, this is about a plague that wipes out a good portion of the population, most of the population. And, on a personal note, I made the mistake of reading this while it was like the week that we officially had the world had officially declared the global pandemic in March of 2020. And then the lockdown. And I was like reading The Stand while this was happening. But in a way, it was kind of nice to explore a worst case scenario, so everything else feels a little bit safer in comparison. But this is another classic example of the evil that people do to each other. But it becomes more of a biblical good versus evil, kind of a grandiose opera playing on the stage in this magnum opus of an 1,100-page book. Also, read the uncut version. Do not read the regular version, because the uncut stuff actually, I think, adds a lot to the story. But, it's a similar case with Swan Song. I think it ends in a way that it opens it up to a wider story. And I would have loved to see a sequel. Even if it's a novella, it would have been nice to explore what happens to the characters after the events of The Stand. And of course, if you want a little bit of a contextual reference to The Stand, Dark Tower. Again, it's the roots to branches thing. It's kind of Stephen King's magnum opus, and a lot of these stories run through it. So there's a little bit of intersection point between The Stand and The Dark Tower. So if you've read The Stand and you're like, I wish I had a little bit more, there's something that you can explore. That I think it's in books 3 and 4, if I remember correctly, or just 4. I can't quite remember. No, it's 4, Wizard and Glass, yeah. So there's at least a little bit of exploration, but it's more of a kind of a Easter egg thing rather than an actual full in-depth exploration. So that would be the third one on this list. Now, the fourth one on this list is actually a trilogy, and it's kind of more horror thriller than straight up horror. And this one is by an author named Blake Crouch, who writes lightning fast thrillers. He is kind of known as the successor to Michael Crichton in that he writes page turners. He makes you think about the science behind things. But before he kind of wrote his more sciencey books like Dark Matter, which has been adapted, Recursion, which is optioned, Upgrade, which is optioned. Before he wrote those, he wrote a trilogy called Wayward Pines, which takes place in Wayward Pines, Idaho. There's a Secret Service agent who's going to look for his partner that's gone missing in Wayward Pines. And when he wakes up there after a mysterious accident, he finds out he's not able to leave. And I'm just going to leave it there. And it kind of slowly starts to devolve into this just insane, mad story. I mean, it's just fantastic. And I don't want to spoil anything because, again, this is like a twist and turns kind of a thing. It's got a lot of horrific elements in it. And the way it ends is cathartic in some ways, but there's kind of an epilogue. and the way, there's the characters that survive to live another day, it ends right on a particular point where like, oh, come on, that's the end of the story. Like, that seems like it's the beginning of the next story. So like, why would you end it there? And it's honestly a poetic ending, but at the same time, I feel like there actually is enough of a distance between this trilogy and whatever story that could take place after the events that unfold in that trilogy that could actually be a phenomenal addendum. Maybe a fourth book, maybe a novella. Could be really cool to explore that whole universe and kind of what happens to these characters. So, that's one where it's like, okay, fine, Blake Crouch, like I get the poetic ending to the series and everything. But I would have loved to see, and I think there was actually more to explore there. So, and the last but not least one is one actually I just finished last night. And it is probably one of the scariest books I have ever read. And I want to do a dedicated review of this. And it is called The Deep by Nick Cutter. So the long and short of this is, I'm going to kind of summarize it for you very briefly without spoiling anything. But there's this disease, and this is on the back of the book, by the way. There's a disease called the Gets, which is ravaging the globe. It makes people forget kind of small things at first, like where they left their car keys and stuff. And then they start to kind of forget larger things like, who they are, who their parents are, and this kind of thing. And finally, their body starts to forget involuntarily how to make their heart beat and stuff, and they die. There's kind of this rumored ambrosia that's kind of at the bottom of the Mariana Trench, like miles below the ocean surface. So there's an expedition that goes down there, and they kind of lose contact with the regular world, and so one of the persons in that expedition's brother goes down to see what might have happened, and insanity ensues from there. And it's just that it plays on this fear. It's kind of a double fear in the sense that like your mind is the fear when you're down there, you're kind of isolated from everything, but then there's also the pressure of like you're at a place that humanity has never explored before, maybe is not meant to explore. And I'll just leave it at that. But I will say, like, the ending is so harrowing. I was getting heart palpitations while I was reading that book through and through. It just is so diabolical. And the ending, when there's a particular resolution, it resolves not in a way you would expect. And there's this kind of big watershed moment that happens. Watershed, get it? I'm always a jack of all trades, master of puns, I always like to say. But there's a watershed moment that happens, and then it just ends. And I was like, oh, come on. There's a sequel story here that would have a completely different vibe to it, actually, but would continue that story really well, I think. And it would take it in a completely different territory, so it wouldn't feel like just fan service where it's like, okay, yeah, we're just going back to the same stuff again, It's not about that anymore. It could be about something else. And I think that would have been really fascinating to explore. And I keep holding out into hope. Like, Nick Cutter's a newer author compared to some of the other ones on this list, right? And so, maybe he will explore and revisit that universe at some point. Here's hoping. But let me know, like, what are your thoughts on this list? Have you read any of these? Do you agree? Do you disagree? I always say every opinion is valid, and it's very, it's very valuable. Because I think, when we all have different experiences to the books that we read, it's nice to kind of talk about them and go like, oh yeah, I never thought about things that way before. So leave it in the comments if you've read any of these and you agree or disagree. And then also, let me know if you have any others to add to this list, because I'm always looking for more books that leave me hanging and going, I wish there was another one. But it's actually kind of a nice feeling at the same time, right? Because, you feel like, oh, it's always better to be left wanting more than be left going, well, that was a waste of time, or I never want to go back there again, It's always a testament to the world building, the characters, and all the other things we love in our novels. So with that, I'm Nick Hill with Shelf-Esteem. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already. It always helps the algorithm gods push this out to the right people. And hope you have a lovely day, y'all. And I will be giving you a weekly update in just a couple days, so sit tight for another video. In the meantime, be good to yourselves, be good to each other. I'll see you on the next one. Take care.